on the continent opposing France is Austria. So they are now allied with Britain and, as I mentioned, Piedmont, which plays a small role in Italy. But in November of 1799, Bonaparte, who has just returned from Egypt, turns out to be the first consul of France because he becomes involved in a coup, the so-called coup of Brumaire in November of 1799, that overthrows the French Directory and establishes a three-person council. The other two councillors thought that they just needed some brash general to be their, quote, sword, unquote. Well, of course, it turns out, because they chose Napoleon Bonaparte, that the sword runs the show, and he becomes first consul. But his position is very shaky, as you might imagine, in Paris, and he faces this Austrian enemy that is trying to press the French both in Italy and in Germany, as we'll see in a second. And he needs a victory to, A, regain Italy, but also to secure this very shaky political future that he's facing. The Austrians, for their part, are intent on war. And they're driven by, once again, as so often the case with Austria, by a war party that's very intent on war and overwhelms those who think that maybe a conflict with France is not such a grand idea. So next one, please.
There we go.
So we're in the spring of 1800. And if we look at the strategic situation, both sides face a two-front situation. Bonaparte, so in Germany and then in Italy, Bonaparte forms what he calls the Army of the Reserve. And that becomes a force that he can send either to Germany or to Italy, depending on how the enemy behaves. He puts it nominally under his, the man who will become his famous chief of staff in the empire, Alexandre Berthier. And he's able to shift either way, depending on the circumstances and how he views things. But in April of 1800, the Austrians launch a surprise offensive in Italy against General Massena, who's commanding the French army of Italy, as you can see down there on the kind of bottom left of your screen, a fairly small army, heavily outnumbered by the Austrians. And the Austrians are fairly dormant in Germany along the Rhine. So that decides Bonaparte to go to Italy. Next, please.
Yes.
So we find that General Massena is cooped up in Genoa because he's been overwhelmed by the Austrian offensive. His army is small, quite ragged. He retires into the city. The Austrians push all the way to Nice, and we end up with these typical, if you've read any of the stories of sieges in that era, the typical scenes of all the horses, cats, rats, dogs being consumed. The men are eating bread made of sawdust and all sorts of other unmentionables. So the situation is very, very bad. And Massena, therefore, that's the only French hold on Italy is Massena's hold on the city of Genoa. Next one. So having decided to cross over the Alps and to march into Italy, Bonaparte plans this very bold strike over the mountains. His principal aim is to cut off the Austrians, force them to retire, bring them into battle, and defeat them. His secondary effort is to relieve Genoa. The Austrians are convinced he's focused on Genoa, and certainly he wants to relieve Genoa, bring Massena's men out of their siege situation, but the principal idea is to defeat the Austrian main army under a general named Melas, who we'll talk about in a moment. In the meantime, General Suchet, future Marshal of France, does manage to hold the Austrians down near Nice, as you can see in the lower left, and Massena is still cooped up in Genoa. Bonaparte hopes that Massena can hold out long enough to tie down a major portion of the Austrian army while he crosses over the mountains. And it's springtime, it's snowy, it's very difficult, the weather's bad, and so it's going to be a difficult passage over the Alps, over several alpine passes. So he wants Massena to hold out as long as possible to tie down the Austrians while he gets over the mountains. Next one.
Yep.
And of course, we have two of the famous images of Napoleon crossing the Alps, Jacques-Louis David on the right there with the iconic propaganda picture of heroic Napoleon, and then probably the more realistic one, crossing over on a mule led by some local alpine guide, some fellow who knows the trails and passes. But it's although the Jacques-Louis David painting is, of course, propaganda, it's not entirely without some substance, even if Napoleon had to cross over, or Bonaparte had to cross over on a less distinguished horse than the great stallion you see off on the right-hand side. Next one, please.
Yep.
Okay, now despite the resistance that the French face, and in particular, many of you may have read about Fort Bard, which blocks part of the Great St. Bernard Pass, and is shown there with the red arrow, which holds out until early June and makes it very difficult for the French to bring vehicles into Italy over this pass. And that means a lot of their artillery and a lot of their ammunition gets left behind. But despite this resistance, despite bad weather, despite all sorts of delays, the Alpine offensive succeeds. Napoleon draws in some reinforcements from Germany, even though the commander there, General Moreau, is reluctant to give them up. And those come under General Moncey, as you can see in the center of the slide there. Massena, unfortunately for the French, is forced to surrender in early June. But because the Austrians are now keen to break off the siege, after all, the French have now appeared in the great valley of the Po River. They're marching on Milan, the center of the screen there. So the Austrian commander is keen to break off the siege, draw all of his forces together to oppose Bonaparte. And as a result, because they're eager to break off the siege, Massena gets generous terms, which is to say he is allowed to reuse his army in the future. And he doesn't have to parole for a year, or they're not taken prisoner or anything along those lines. He can march away with the honors of war and go and join Suchet, and that will be important in how the Battle of Marengo develops. So he will still be a threat to the Austrians down there in the south. And you can, we'll talk about that a little more in the next slide, please.
Yep.
Okay, so the Austrians are now cut off, and General Melas is scrambling to respond. He aims to assemble around the city of Alexandria, which you can see the red circle there. That's Melas and the bulk of his army where he's trying to gather. Bonaparte, who has gone well to the east, to Piacenza and whatnot, he now will swing to the west to face Melas. He's marching south of the Great Po River, seeking battle. And by 12 June, the armies are about 10 miles apart. The Austrians in the west, the French in the east, so kind of backwards to what we might imagine. And they're separated by this agricultural plain, and that's where all of your leaden armies, or metal armies, are now assembled, and that's where the battle will be fought. And I highlight or underlined agricultural because there's an impression in some quarters that the plain of Marengo was like a pancake and absolutely flat. But as we'll talk about, it's actually full of all sorts of minor obstacles that have a tactical impact. So we talked about Suchet and Massena. Now they're very weak, and Massena's men in particular, having endured this very long and dreadful siege, but they're loitering off the Austrian southern flank. And if you look where it says Massena, right next to that is Genoa, and you'll see that they are almost directly south of where Melas is located. And so that will be a cause of concern for Melas. Now, Bonaparte, on the other hand, is concerned about the Austrian forces in Genoa. So both sides, both commanders, are concerned about the forces down on their southern flanks, and that will play a role in how they approach the battle. And we'll talk about the terrain in the next slide. Well, actually, we'll talk about what happens on the 13th of June. We stopped on the 12th. We'll proceed to the 13th, the day prior to the battle. So here we are. Here's this plain between the river, the Scrivia River, that's off on your right, and the Bormida River on your left, and the city of Alexandria, you can see with the Austrian red circles all around it. The 13th of June had been a day of downpours, a lot of rain. In fact, it's been raining for some time prior to the battle. On the 13th of June, the French pushed the Austrians back, so moving from east to west, again, kind of contrary to where you would imagine, since France lies way off to the west. They drive back the Austrian flank guard under a general with the very Austrian name of O'Reilly, Feldmarschall Lieutenant O'Reilly, but they halt then at an Austrian bridgehead redoubt, which is a little hard to see, but we'll highlight that in a second, If you see where it says Alexandria and you see Melas's two circles there, the circle on the right shows kind of where the bridgehead is over the Bormida River. So the French push the Austrians all the way back there. They capture the town of Marengo, and this will have an impact on how the Austrians look at things. Both sides, however, are misunderstanding what the other is up to. Bonaparte, as I worried, is concerned. Bonaparte is worried that the Austrians are trying to escape. After all, his relatively small force under General Victor had pushed the Austrians all the way back to the river. So clearly, the Austrian commander must be keen to get away and get back and kind of reconnect his line of communications. So Bonaparte, worried that that might be the case and also concerned about the forces to the south and around Genoa, sends a division off to the north, and he sends General Desai down to the south as precautions. He does not expect an attack, so his forces are not prepared to meet what the Austrians are about to do. On the Austrian side, however, there's a mistaken belief, especially by their chief of staff, who will feature prominently in this discussion, that they want to attack. But they mistakenly believe that the French are off to the north. And you see the little brown box that says Salé. That's where the Austrians think the main French army is. Whereas in reality, they're deployed, as you can see with the blue circles on the map. So the Austrians mistakenly believe that the French are way off at Salé in the northeast, but they're not. However, that's what they will base their plans on, as we'll talk about in just a moment. Next one, please.
Yep.
So I like this map, and you can find this map on a website called Obscure Battles, run by a fellow named Barry. And we'll talk. We can go to the next slide right now, but I wanted to show this and give credit to Mr. Barry and his Obscure Battles site because I think that it portrays the terrain very well for Marengo as well as for other battles. And we'll use this map in a moment when we get back to the terrain. So let's go to the Austrian army, please.
Yep.
Alrighty. So we have an Austrian army that is divided as the battle approaches, or as they plan for the battle, into three columns, as they call them. And I've arrayed them here from north to south. So from the Austrian perspective, that would be left, main, and right flanks. On the north is Feldmarschall Lieutenant Ott von Ott. He's got 17 battalions, 6 squadrons, about 27 guns. In the center is the main column, and that's General of the Cavalry Melas and his Chief of Staff, Generalmajor Anton von Sack. And you can see that's where the bulk of the Austrian forces are. And then we have O'Reilly, who's off on the right, and he's going to be kind of a flank guard, more or less, with a total Austrian force of somewhere on the order of 32,000, thereabouts. 2,000 of those, as we'll talk about in a moment, are going to be detached before the battle even begins. And I put down here that they have 87 guns. However, after I sent this to Philip, I looked further, and actually the Austrians probably had closer to 100 guns. And the Austrians will be dominant in both cavalry and in artillery. And the Austrians, in their thinking, had been hoping to draw the French into a battle in the plains, not in the mountains as they faced them in 1796, and not in the mountains as they faced them in 1800, as the French Army of the Reserve is coming over the Alps, but rather onto the plains, because the Austrians are confident that their artillery and their cavalry is superior to that the French can bring to bear. And they're correct. Note, however, that most of the Austrian guns are 3-pounders. I've been trying to find whether more detail on the Austrian artillery. They have a number of cavalry batteries, that means 6-pounders and howitzers, but they only have, as far as I can determine, 2 12-pounders in the entire army. However, the number of guns is enormous compared to what the French can bring to bear. So that's the army, left, main, and right columns, moving from east to west. And we'll turn now to talk about the Austrian headquarters for a moment before we turn to the French.
Is that the next slide, Jack?
Yeah, okay. So we have General of the Cavalry, Michael von Melas. He's a competent general. He's a sound commander. He's not some buffoon. Oftentimes we think, oh, all these Austrians were idiots. But that's not true. Melas was a decent general, but he is an old man. In terms of 1800, he's about 71 years old, and his health is not very good. So that will have an impact on what happens late in the day. His attitude as he approaches the battle is unclear. When we read through the Austrian accounts, some of the eyewitnesses, some of his staff officers say that he was discouraged and rather glum, but then others record that when he went to talk to the troops, that his spirits rose and that he became confident. So it's difficult to know what his attitude was as he approached battle with Bonaparte. But he is, of course, a conservative general with the 18th century outlook. Nonetheless, a competent fellow. His chief of staff, the other key personality on the Austrian side here, is General-Major Anton von Sach. And Sach is a man of great self-confidence. In fact, excessive self-confidence, probably. He's intelligent, he's very clever, but he's kind of, from the attitude of his fellows, he's kind of a school book soldier and something of a pedant. In fact, many of them detest him. So there's a lot of friction inside the Austrian headquarters, including between him, the chief of staff, and his deputy, as well as other staff officers, such as the later on very famous General Radetzky. At this time, he's still a colonel. Radetzky has no use for Sach whatsoever and thinks he is leading the army to defeat. So we have this decent general in overall command, General Melas, and then we have Anton von Sach, who will play a crucial role at the conclusion of the battle. So that's the Austrian side. Let's turn now to the French.
Yep.
Okay, so we laid the Austrians out north to south, left, middle, or left and main and right flanks. The French were looking at kind of from the left-hand side, the east to the west, in sequence of how they arrive on the eastern side of Marengo, the plain there, and engage in the battle. So the first is General Victor. The French don't have formal divisions, but these are kind of proto-divisions that will lead to the Corps d'Armée, for which Napoleon becomes famous later on. So we have General Victor, and then General Lannes, who will come up on Victor's right. Victor is around the town of Marengo. And then we have the Consular Guard. The guard is very small. Of course, Napoleon is only the first consul. He's not an emperor. And the giant imperial guard that we think of in later years is not yet formed. The whole guard only consists of 2 battalions of grenadiers, some chasseurs, some light infantry, 4 6-pounders, and 3 cavalry squadrons. I put Bessieres, who's still just a chief of brigade, I put him in parentheses because he's only in charge of the cavalry. And I put the arrow there between him and Lannes because Lannes and Bessieres have a dispute on the field of battle. And those of you who have looked at 1809, we did not talk about this at Wagram because Lannes by then is dead. But at Aspern-Essling, Bessieres and Lannes have a similar dispute where Lannes does not believe that Bessieres is driving the cavalry to strike home, to charge home. And they have a dispute here at Marengo also. And the same thing happens at Aspern-Essling in 1809. And then finally, coming to the rescue is General Desailly. And he has 2 divisions under him, and we'll talk about them in more detail. And the French cavalry, which plays an absolutely crucial role. The overall commander is Murat, but the man of the hour at Marengo is General François-Étienne Kellerman, son of the famous Marshal from the Battle of Valmy, and a very competent officer in his own part. The cavalry is fairly small on the French side. They're only about 4,000. We saw there are about almost 8,000 Austrian cavalry. And Kellerman will lead a crucial charge at the end of the battle. And he will then say later on, allegedly, "My little charge has placed the crown of France on your head." Apparently, he was bold enough or brash enough or angry enough to say this to Bonaparte himself at the end of the battle when he went to report that night, on the night of the 14th of June. And he retains, because he doesn't feel he gained enough sort of respect and recognition for his role in the battle, he remains bitter until his death in 1835, writing in it even in 1834 about how unfortunate it was that he was never recognized for his role, or his role was diminished. You can see the total of the French army is only about 24,000, and they only have somewhere on the order of 25 guns. Now they have a number of 6-pounders, 8-pounders, a couple of 12-pounders, so they might have some heavier weight in terms of percentage, but compared to the Austrians, who are going to bring 80 to 100 guns to the field, the French artillery is badly outnumbered. Okay, so those are the 2 armies. The French, of course, are commanded by Bonaparte. Berthier is technically in command of this Army of the Reserve, but of course, the real commander is Napoleon Bonaparte on the field. The chief of staff of the army, by the way, is General Pierre Dupont, the man of Belen, who many of you will recognize his name from that incident early on in the Peninsular War. So those are the two armies and their leaders. Let's turn to what the weather and terrain were like at Marengo on 14 June 1800.
Yep.
The area of the battlefield is indeed largely flat, but it is not without its minor dips and rises and so shifts in terrain. There are important watercourses. We talked about the Bormida River, which is off on the eastern side that bounds the battlefield on that side. And I should say east, not west, sorry. The Bormida is impassable, so no one's going to get across that except on a bridge. No fording, no wading. You need a bridge or a ferry. Then on the right-hand side of the field, off to the east, is the Scrivia River. That's about 14 kilometers from the town of Marengo. And it's normally easy to cross, but because of all the rain, it is now a torrent and very difficult to get over. The Po River lies about 13 kilometers north of the town of Marengo. It does not come into the battle, but it's useful just to place it in context. And then in the middle, really on the western side of the battlefield, is the Fontenone stream. It is full of water. Normally, again, a small stream in this agricultural terrain, but it is now full of water, and it has marshy tree-lined banks, which makes it difficult to cross for infantry and truly impassable for artillery. There's a lot of vegetation. There are ripe crops. In those days, wheat, which was prominent in this area, would grow to 6 feet or so high, so it could obscure the approach of infantrymen or artillery or anything low to the ground. And there are lots of vineyards and woodlots in the center of the field. And curiously, something that we think of vineyards as now being quite orderly, but apparently many of the vineyards in those days in Italy, at least in this part of Italy, were vines strung from mulberry trees. So mulberry trees were prominent as to support a thriving silk industry in this part of Italy, and they would string grapevines from the mulberry trees to support growing wine or producing wine. So it's a different kind of vineyard than we would normally think of. Marengo village seems to have been very defensible. The French hold out there very stoutly for a long time, as well as the number of little cascinas or farmsteads that dot the terrain. Unlike the preceding days, this is a clear day, the 14th of June. It's very sunny and it's hot. So it'll be a very different day from what the soldiers have experienced. Sunrise is around 4:30 in the morning. The sun doesn't set till 8 o'clock or so at night. And that means, of course, that you have what the US military calls before morning nautical twilight. So an hour or so, 2 hours before, you can start to discern things and move troops effectively. And of course, an hour or two after 8 o'clock at night, you can still conduct operations with some effect. So that's the terrain and the weather. And again, as you have questions, we can take those up at the end here, or as you like, Philip, if you want to do that now. But let's turn to the next slide and we'll look at the key locations on the battlefield that we'll talk about as we go ahead.
Yeah, we got it.
Okay, again, this is from Mr. Berry's Obscure Battles. And we'll show here the Bormida River, again, on the west or the left-hand side of your screen. The Tanaro River is the one up to the top left corner. And I've highlighted here the Bridgehead Redoubt, through which the Austrians will debouch onto the field. We'll talk about that because that's a real problem. And as we move east from the Bridgehead Redoubt and the Bormida, we come to the Fontenone stream. And then from north to south, the key towns of Castelcariolo, which will be one of the Austrian objectives, and the town of Marengo on the Fontenone stream, a little town of Spinetta or hamlet of Spinetta, and likewise Caccina Grossa, and then San Giuliano. Sorry, I don't speak Italian. I should invest in Duolingo or Rosetta Stone or something to try and improve my Italian. But San Giuliano will be sort of the end of as far as the French are going to retreat as the Austrians push them back from west to east. So those are the key locations on the battlefield, and we'll now take a look, with those in mind, take a look at the Austrian plan.
Yes.
Right, so Zock has come up with this concept. We talked about his belief that the French are way off to the northeast, or not way off, but they're off to the northeast there at Salé. So he's made his plan based on that assumption. But the French, when he made that plan, the French had not pushed the Austrians back across the plain and not forced them back into the little bridgehead there on the left-hand side of the screen. Well, even though that has now occurred, so all the tactical situation has entirely changed, he makes no changes in his plan. So despite this unanticipated French advance. And his plan is that General Ott, Feldmarschall Lieutenant von Ott, will advance on the right, as we talked about, north to south, the right-hand, or the, sorry, advance on the left. The left-hand column under Ott is the second largest, and they're going to march through Castel Ceriolo to pin the presumed French off near Salé. The central column under Melas will then march through Marengo village itself to turn north and presumably strike the French in the flank, while O'Reilly, with a very small force, will be a flank guard covering the Austrian right and just being sure that no French are sneaking up from down near Genoa or any place else. So he's a small force as a flank guard. The main column will go through Marengo and then turn north in Sock's concept, while Ott pins the French down. Bonaparte, for his part, is not expecting an attack at all, so he has no plan per se for the 14th of June. He is concerned about flank threats from the Austrians at Genoa, as we talked about, and therefore moves Desai down there to Rivalta, way on the lower right-hand corner of your screen. You can see General Desai with one of his divisions under General Boudet, who played a big role at Wagram, if you may remember, and General Lepoip, who is then sent north to the Po, because Bonaparte thinks that the Austrians are trying to retreat. So he wants to cover his flanks and be flexible to respond when he discovers which way the Austrians are retreating, because they could retreat to Genoa, they could retreat north towards the Tyrol and the Austrian homelands. So he's trying to set himself up to respond when he learns which way Melas is retreating, as he assumes it will be the case. But of course, that's not the case. Indeed, the Austrians are about to attack, as we'll talk about here in a second.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Austrians do indeed plan to attack, but their plans go awry almost at once. The plan was Sock's plan was based on the notion that the Austrian army would move around 2 in the morning and cross over the Bormida River from Alessandria, from west to east, and deploy onto this plain around to the west of the town of Marengo and the Fontanone stream. And then march off, as we talked about, Ott on the left, Melas in the center, O'Reilly down in the right. But because of the French advance, they cannot do that. First, they have to make some space to deploy. So they have to clear the French from east of the river. That means that all of the Austrian army has to cross the Bormida, again, impassable, and they have to do that through the bridgehead redoubt. Now, they have 2 bridges there because there was one existing on the main road in the first place. They built a second one, but there's only one exit from the bridgehead. So even though they have 2 bridges, everything comes down to a bottleneck as they leave through the redoubt that's covering the bridgehead. So this does not smack of very clear thinking or solid planning, but that's where it was. There are no other bridges that are either available or constructed. And sometimes people mistake a bridge that had been constructed north of Alessandria on the Bormida, but the Austrians had dismantled that to put it down leading into the bridgehead. That becomes the second bridge into the bridgehead. So they're already bottlenecked, having to force the entire army, all 30-odd thousand, 28,000 of them, through this one exit from the bridgehead redoubt. But then there's further delay because they get reports that Suchet is moving up from the southwest. So off to from our perspective on our maps, off to the left side, left bottom. And therefore, the Melas and Sock decide to detach a cavalry brigade to cover that flank and make sure Suchet does not cause them problems. Well, that's all fine and good. However, the cavalry brigade that's detached has already crossed the river. So now they have to turn around, and 2,000 horsemen are going to turn around and march back from east to west over the river. And that causes, as you might imagine, enormous traffic jams, all kinds of delay, all kinds of disruption as these 2 large cavalry regiments, about 2,000 horsemen, move back across the river and then go down to face the non-threat from Suchet, because Suchet is not moving on their rear. And it turns out that that was mistaken reporting. So anyway, a great delay in trying to just even get across the river. Additionally, the Austrians have what are called Laufbrücken, which are pedestrian bridges they can use for infantry to cross small watercourses. And that would have been very useful crossing the Fontenone stream, but those are left behind at the very end of the column. So when they reach the Fontenone and find how difficult it is, their little infantry bridges are nowhere to be seen. So let's now turn to, so now we set the stage. We've talked about the terrain, we've talked about the armies, we talked about the Austrian plan. Napoleon is thinking the Austrians are retreating, doesn't have a plan per se. So now let's switch to the battle itself, please.
Yep.
Okay, so this is the famous painting that I mentioned at the very start. And this is done by Louis-François Lejeune. Many of you will recognize, you did Borodino, I think, from what Philip said, as well as Gettysburg, since last we spoke. And you may recognize Lejeune from his famous painting of Borodino. So that we'll talk about the details of this painting, because I think it's interesting and illustrative of the battle in many ways, as well as the style of art in those days. We'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation. But as a starting point, it's useful to think, and you can evaluate the battle in all sorts of ways. I think it breaks into two or three fairly neat phases with short lulls in between. The first of those is the struggle for Marengo itself, because the Austrians have to, again, clear space to deploy. And that means they have to get over the Fontenone, they have to clear the French out from opposite their bridgehead, and then get over the Fontenone stream. The main bridge is at Marengo, they have to take Marengo. Well, then they'll have to reorganize and launch their breakout as they learn that indeed the French are not up to the northeast at Salé, they're right in front of them. And that will be the Austrian breakout phase. And then finally is the French counterattack that leads to the victory that Bonaparte will achieve here. Okay, so let's turn to the struggle for Marengo.
Yep.
Okay, so this goes on from about 8 in the morning till around 2 in the afternoon. And in part, that's because the Austrians have difficulty deploying in the confined space east of their bridgehead. But it also is a tribute to the very, very tough defense the French put up, largely initially under General Victor, then supported by Lens, as shown here by the arrow of Lens marching up from San Giuliano to come up on Victor's right. And the very, very tough defense they put up, the Austrians have to attack the village 3 to 5 times. Again, you never know. There are always these discussions, oh, the town changed hands 7 times, 3 times, 2 times, whatever. But there are at least 3 major Austrian assaults on Marengo and this French position along the Fontenone before they're successful in pushing Victor back. O'Reilly will go down and defeat a small French detachment under a gentleman named Dompierre, but he then wanders off to the south and really is kind of out of the picture for the rest of the battle. Ott will drive north towards Castel Cariolo, as we talked about, which he reaches somewhere around noon or a little after noon, and places himself, therefore, on the French right flank. So by 1400, when Marengo finally falls to the Austrians, Victor and Lens are badly battered. Much of their artillery, not all, but much of their artillery is lost. They are low on ammunition. Again, we talked about how the crossing the Alps and the delays imposed by the defense of Fort Bard and just the terrain meant that a lot of the French ammunition and other artillery was left behind. But they now, Victor and Lens, find themselves with many of their guns gone, ammo low, and they're outflanked to the north by General Ott's move on Castel Cariolo. However, the Austrians, in finally evicting the French from Marengo and forcing their way over the Fontenone, find themselves very damaged as well. As their initial assault forces have been badly shot up, many of their officers are killed, including several important generals, and they are very disorganized. So they have to pause to recuperate, and there's no immediate pursuit, despite the presence of a large Austrian cavalry force. There's no immediate pursuit. Instead, they take a moment to reorganize, and before they drive further to the east. So we'll have the next image here.
Yep.
This shows this is obviously a modern painting showing Hungarian infantrymen as the Austrians are launching their attack, trying to get over the Fontenone stream. And although this is obviously not done by someone who was there at the time or anything, it does give a good impression of the challenges the Austrians faced by just getting over this narrow but deep and marshy banked little water obstacle, with especially the enemy lined up on the other side. And it's probably useful to point out that this is a veteran French army. This is not some collection of brand new conscripts or enthusiastic but ignorant volunteers, as we think about in the early 1790s after the revolution, the early French revolutionary armies. This is more or less an army of veterans. These are pretty tough guys. And so the Austrians are now going to have to cross over and face them and make their way through this water obstacle in the process. So, okay, so that's the Austrian success in the struggle for Marengo. After 5 or 6 hours, they take the town, they get over the stream, and now we'll go to the next phase. They're prepared to advance.
Yeah.
So it's around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 1500, and Ott has taken Castel Cariolo. He's slowly moving to the south as Melas marches down the main road, which connects Marengo, which is sort of hidden by the Melas label, to San Giuliano, which is off there where you can see the Lannes arrow retreating. The French are in a disordered retreat. There are clumps of them that have kept their order. Lannes in particular seems to have more or less kept his guys in line. Victor, who suffered very badly, is in more disarray. So the French are retreating. There are hundreds of wounded and who are making their way back. And of course, the wounded have fellows and comrades who are assisting them or pretending to assist them or otherwise making their way out of the line of battle. So the main road is quite crowded with all these refugees, some legitimate, some perhaps not so. The vivandières, the sutlers, and everyone else are trying to get away from the front lines. Bonaparte now arrives somewhere around midday to 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Because he had been not present at the start of the battle. He didn't think there was going to be a battle. So he's way off the right-hand side of your screen. But he arrives, sees what's going on, and remains calm. And everyone, even the people who are not big Bonaparte fans, recall that he was very calm the entire time and makes decisions rapidly, clearly, concisely, but calmly. And one of those decisions is to recall General Desai, who was down to the southeast, as you'll remember. Now, Desai did not, although sometimes people say this, he did not on his own initiative march to the sound of the guns. But what he did do, after crossing the Scrivia River that we showed at the beginning, is Desai hears the cannons up at Marengo. And rather than continuing to march as he had been ordered to, he stops. He slows his march and then stops and waits and sends for new orders, thinking that maybe something is up in the north where Victor and Marengo are, and perhaps he will be needed, and indeed he is. So he has stopped. Napoleon or Bonaparte recalls him, and at the same time, Bonaparte sends the Guard, the small force, these 2 battalions of grenadiers and with some chasseurs, as well as Desai's other division under General Monnier. He sends them forward. The one brigade under General Carrel Sancerre, who you may remember from Wagram in Massena's 4th Corps at the time, they actually get into Castel Cariolo, despite Ott's presence. They're quickly evicted, but that distracts Ott. The Guard is covering the gap between Castel Cariolo and the right flank of the Lannes division, and that's where that explosion kind of symbol is, because the Guard is hit from all sides, these 2 battalions of grenadiers, and badly damaged. Now they're badly hammered, but sometimes it's portrayed as if they were entirely wiped out or all captured or killed or wounded. That does not seem to be the case. It's very difficult to discern precisely what happens to these 2 battalions, but they do reappear later on in the battle. So it seems like, yes, they suffered severe losses, but were not entirely destroyed and had sufficient cohesion to keep fighting later on in the same day. But that can't save the day. That does hold off the Austrians a bit, but Napoleon Bonaparte really needs some assistance, and that's going to come from General Desai, who is now en route. So there's this lull as the Austrians reorganize and then resume their advance in the center. From the Austrian perspective, the battle seems won. And certainly from the French perspective, the battle seems lost. So Melas, who has had either two horses shot out from under him, or his horses have fallen. In any case, he's been injured twice. So a 71-year-old man, he's fallen from his horse, or his horse has been shot out from under him twice, and he's been badly bruised. He's knocked about. He's not feeling, his health isn't that good to begin with, and he's somewhat aged. So he retires around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, between 2 and 3. He retires to Alexandria. And although Feldmarschall-Leutnant von Keim should have taken over as the senior general, in fact, the person who takes over is the chief of staff. It's kind of typical in the Austrian system, and that is Anton von Sock. And we'll talk about him in just a second after we have another illustration of, this is a von Meyerbach print, who is, I really like his good artistic style and gives you a good sense of things. And you see here Bonaparte in the center of the picture, trying to reorganize, rally the troops at the crisis of the battle. And on the right-hand side, you can see soldiers helping their wounded comrades to try and get them back to an aid station, as dreadful as those places might be. Okay, next slide, please.
Yeah.
So the Austrians are on a high note. They think they have won, and they just have to pursue the defeated French off to the east, and they will have a great triumph over Bonaparte. Sock in particular thinks that he's got Bonaparte really where he wants him, and is marching ahead with a brigade of grenadiers and the infantry regiment number 11 von Wallis under General St. Julien. But as they're doing that, Desai with Boudet's division arrives. And Desai is able to put together a very, very effective combined arms attack in coordination with Bonaparte that will put an end to the Austrian advance. This lead Austrian force, these 4,000 or so men, the brigade of grenadiers and the 11th infantry, they're the ones that are shown under that explosion kind of symbol. In front of them is the 9th Léger, and General then, later Marshal Marmont, who's the commander of the French artillery at Marengo. He puts together at Desai tells Bonaparte, look, I can counterattack, but I'm going to need artillery support. So Bonaparte directs Marmont to put together whatever guns he can do. And despite the fact that the French have lost a lot of cannon, Marmont is able to assemble a dozen or 18 perhaps guns in the center of the field, as shown there with a little MAR block. That's just to the north of the main road. To the south of the main road is the 9th Léger. They are fresh, they're very competent troops, and they are kind of hidden from the Austrians by the high crops. At the same time, Kellerman, with the French heavy cavalry, moves to the north. And so he's going to be to the north of Marmont and the line of guns. And in just the right moment, Desai launches his counterattack. Led by the 9th Léger, the Desai block shows the other two regiments of Boudet's division. But the 9th and Marmont's guns halt the Austrian advance. So as the Austrians are somewhat stunned by the sudden appearance of these French infantrymen 100 meters or so in front of them, who let loose heavy volleys of musketry, and then Marmont's canister, they are struck in the flank by totally unprepared by the unseen French heavy cavalry supported by dragoons. The grenadiers and the 11th infantry tumble back in great confusion, and so does the Austrian cavalry. The 9th Light Dragoons, as they were known at the time, Liechtenstein Light Dragoons, do not perform well, and many of the Austrians blame their cavalry's poor performance for this defeat. They all go tumbling back in great confusion, and if you think about in your war game terms, when a routing unit falls back through another unit, what do? You've got to do a morale check. Well, most of the Austrian morale checks fail. So the entire army is flowing back now towards Marengo from San Giuliano, and where they have encountered this French counterattack. In the process, Sock, who was leading this advance with the grenadiers, is captured. Feldmarschall-Leutnant von Ott, up to the north, he sees that things are not looking too good in the center and decides that he might be outflanked and defeated, so he too retires. O'Reilly also falls back, seeing that things are going very poorly. the French are now revived, re-energized by the arrival of reinforcements. Bonaparte and the other generals reinvigorate them, and they pursue to Marengo and all the way to the Bormida River. Desai, at the moment of triumph, just as the Austrians are being thrown back, takes a bullet in the chest that enters near his heart, passes through his heart, exits through his right shoulder, and kills him instantly. There are no great sort of last words of General Desai, and Napoleon thereby loses not only a very competent, skilled general, but also a good friend. So Desai is killed on the field of battle at the moment of his great success. The French pursue the Austrians all the way through Marengo towards the Bormida until nightfall, around 8 or 10, between 8 and 10 o'clock at night. The fighting continues, and the Austrians retire to collect themselves in Alessandria. So that's where the Austrians now are. The French are now all the way to the Bormida River, and let's look at Lejeune's painting for a capsule view of this whole situation.
Yeah.
So as you might think about art at the time, artists would often try to portray things not necessarily in chronological sequence, but put all the events together at once in a painting. And as it happens, most of these things that Lejeune is portraying here actually did happen in very quick succession. So we see in the center, or on the left-hand side here, we see Bonaparte highlighted by an explosion behind him. He's in command. We see above him, again, highlighted by the smoke of combat and an explosion, Desai falling from his horse as he's killed. We see between them the 9th Légier lined up in line formation, pummeling the Austrians with musketry. Moving slightly to the right, we see the fellow on the white horse, that's Sac, being captured. Below him, the battery represented here only by 1 or 2 cannons, but nonetheless Marmont's battery that is pelting the Austrians with canister and round shot. And then off to the center right, Kellerman's cavalry that's smashing into the Austrian column unexpected from the flank. So this painting neatly encapsulates the situation at the crisis of the battle as the tide turns and the French throw the Austrians back and gain this what becomes a great military triumph. So we'll go to the next slide, but again, Lejeune was there as a staff officer, so he was not only an accomplished artist, but he was also a very accomplished military officer and was present at the battle. Later becomes a general, and he's also present at Borodino, which he painted famously, as you probably saw. So let's go to the military aftermath.
Yeah.
So here we see Bonaparte cheering on his troops, whether those are really the grenadiers of his guard or of one of Desai's battalions is not clear, but nonetheless cheering on the men as they are marching on to victory. And it is indeed a tremendous French victory, particularly when contrasted with the disaster that seemed to be facing the Bonaparte and the Army of the Reserve at about between 2 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But both sides are exhausted. The Austrians are shocked and demoralized. Some of the officers desperately want to fight on. They recognize that the French are tired and have been badly hurt in the course of the battle, and they think that their best chance is to continue the fight. But Melas will have a different opinion. The French, of course, are jubilant. They have great faith in Bonaparte. Their faith has been restored, but they have suffered heavy losses. They have suffered from disorganization, and they're low on ammunition. So had the Austrians decided to try and resume the battle, of course, they'd have to get across the river, and how would they do that? Those are all problematic. And there were other French forces available that Bonaparte could have brought in. But nonetheless, the French are not really in a condition to fight another major battle on the 15th of June. So fortunately for them, that becomes not necessary. The Austrians lose about over 9,400 men in the course of the battle. The French claim to lose about 5,800 from all causes, dead, wounded, and captured. The number is likely higher, maybe as high as the Austrians, so a larger percentage of forces, but it's difficult to know. We don't have good figures on the French side. Nonetheless, both armies have suffered heavily, the Austrians in particular, and the Austrians have suffered this great psychological defeat. So that's the military side. Let's turn to the political implications of Marengo.
Yeah.
So what results is what's called the Convention of Alessandria. And this is an armistice to discuss a larger peace between France and Austria. And on the morning of the 15th, Bonaparte sends the technical nominal commander of the Army of the Reserve, General Berthier, to Melas in Alexandria to negotiate terms. Bonaparte's very eager to exploit this success, and he imposes heavy demands. But he's also willing to accept that the Austrians can march away because he's not really ready to face a new battle anyway. Melas, weary, injured, ill, sees no option but acceptance, and he thereby saves his army for his emperor, for the Kaiser, even though some of his officers are outraged that they have not continued the fight and not tried to resume or take a new battle to the French. But what this means is that this armistice means the Austrians abandoned almost all the gains they made in Italy in 1799, and the French regained them. Napoleon, therefore, Bonaparte, can return to Paris as a hero. His military status, his political status has been affirmed, and he is in a much better position than he had been several months earlier. But the war is not over. Talks go on until sometime in November between France and Austria, but there are these peace talks collapse, and war resumes then in November. And at the Battle of Hohenlinden in December of 1800, General Moreau, with the French army in Germany, will defeat the Austrians in Bavaria decisively, and that will seal the French victory. The French also gain a victory on Christmas Day and the day thereafter in Italy along the Mincio River, so that would be east of Marengo at a place called Pozzolo, where they push the Austrians back. Melas is now gone, and the Austrians are commanded by General Bellegarde, who was also at Wagram. So those victories will seal, particularly Hohenlinden, will seal the French triumph in this war of the Second Coalition. Moreau will march from Bavaria into Austria towards Vienna. He doesn't need to go all the way to Vienna because the Austrians give up in the meantime. So when we think about Marengo, did it place the crown on Napoleon's head, as General Kellerman allegedly said in anger when he didn't feel he was getting enough recognition? Well, you could debate that. It certainly, however, was key to Napoleon's rise and eventually assumption of the imperial title, and it certainly becomes a key theme in Napoleon's personal story as he portrays it. He rewrites personally the history of this battle several times to make it seem as if everything was all planned, everything all went along as I had foreseen and as I desired, which of course was not the case. Some of the documents related to the battle seem to have been destroyed, burned, or misplaced, or otherwise expunged. I've not personally looked at the archives, so I don't know that, but that seems to be clearly the case. And he uses the victory at Marengo to inspire his troops at Friedland in 1807, where again he has a great victory on the 14th of June, 1807, over the Russians off in East Prussia. And as they're marching towards Friedland, he reminds the men that the regiments that are marching by that it's the anniversary of Marengo, and this always brings great cheers. And his stepson, his adopted son Eugène de Beauharnais, will get a victory in 1809 at the Battle of Raab in Hungary on the 14th of June. And Napoleon, in congratulating Eugène, will refer to Marengo and say, this is a great granddaughter of Marengo that you have succeeded in defeating the Austrians here at the Battle of Raab on 14 June 1809. So that's the military angle and the political angle of this battle that you're now fighting out with your soldiers there across the Great Table. And we'll turn last to talk a bit about the legacy. Because, of course, Marengo gave us a horse, it gave us a street in Paris, and it gave us a dinner. A fairly easy one to prepare, and indeed, the book here is a fun book by Andrew Uffendell that talks about the battle and the myth of the chicken Marengo. And did Napoleon really have chicken Marengo the night of the battle? Well, probably not, but it's a great story. It's a nice dish, and it's part of the legacy of this famous battle. So, Philip, we'll go to the last slide.
Yeah. Okay, questions and discussion.
Okay, you'll see that as it happens, by a great confluence of circumstances, this is a battle that I'm currently playing with a friend of mine named Dr. Rick Schneid, who's written a lot about the wars in Italy. and I'm the French, where he's the Austrians, and we're fighting it out along the Fontenone stream, which kind of defines where the forces are lined up. Sadly, some of my men are routing off there to the right. We hope we can recover them, but some of his are running away as well. So that's where we stand here. We're going to resume play tomorrow by Zoom. So thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to take any questions or any observations from you gentlemen, and we'll go from there.
Thank you very much, Jan. It's been fantastic. Thank you so much. I wonder if I could kick off with one question, Jack. The crossing of the Bormida is a little bit of a mystery from the books that I've read, in the sense that the Austrians did have a pontoon bridge located up near Castel Ceriolo, and then for unknown reasons seem to have moved it down to their main crossing point at the bridgehead. And if they kept it where it was, it would have given them another crossing, which would have reduced the congestion and also allowed the attack on Ceriolo to have developed much more quickly. Is there anything you found to explain why they did this, which seems rather inexplicable?
Yes, it does seem inexplicable, and it does seem that this would have been Ott's command that would have gone over that bridge in its previous location. But the only explanation that is ever offered is that they wanted to improve the speed with which they could cross the Bormida from Alessandria, and they thought they would lose time by sending Ott on the western side of the river up to that other bridge and crossing that way. And in fact, I think you're quite correct. I think they would have saved time and would have put themselves in a much better position had they used that bridge and not moved it down to join the permanent, I believe it was a stone bridge that led from Alessandria to the bridgehead. So to me, you're exactly correct, and I've not seen any decent explanation other than Sock's peculiar way of thinking that gives what to us here in the latter days would be a reasonable explanation of why they moved that bridge. Sock, by the way, is not demoted or cashiered or anything for the results of this battle. Napoleon lets him go back, even though he's been captured. He interviews him extensively, lets him go back to the Austrian army, and he continues on. He receives awards. He becomes a baron. He has a regiment where he becomes the proprietor of an infantry regiment, and is the chief of staff of the Austrian army of Italy in 1805 under the Archduke Charles. So he continues, his career prospers, even though one could likely blame the defeat at Marengo on him personally, as well as the failures of some of the Austrian cavalry.
Any questions?
Oh yes. What did the Austrians do with all those 3-pounders, which they had an advantage in?
Yes, the Austrian organization at the time had regimental and battalion guns. And these were generally, although it seems kind of an odd combination to me, generally 1 or 2 6-pounders and 4 3-pounders. Why you'd want to mix the calibers like that, again, to me that seems odd, but that was their standard organization. So they had a lot of these 3-pounders, and the French accounts repeatedly talk about coming under heavy artillery fire. Not heavy in the sense of caliber, but lots of it. And so lots of these 3-pounder balls bouncing around. If I can steal a term from a German officer in 1813, bouncing around the grass like rabbits. Which is a phrase I love. Anyway, so the Austrians had a lot of these guns, and sometimes they would combine them into small batteries. So you might take the guns from several battalions and put them together. And they had a number of cavalry batteries, but it's not clear that they employed them in sort of grand battery gun line fashion. But certainly the French suffered heavily from the Austrian artillery fire. But again, when they were fighting in Marengo itself, the artillery was, of course, of less use, and because of some of the way the vineyards and the trees were arrayed, you couldn't necessarily see your target very well, and the 3-pounders don't have much range anyway.
Yeah, makes sense.
Rohan, yeah.
Thanks, Jack. Given the losses that the French took, do you think Melas had any other option but to agree terms?
Yes, I do. Yes, I did. Yeah, and yes, he did have other options. And as I mentioned, a couple of his officers, one in particular was General, well, he was then a colonel, a fellow named Neipperg, who is the fellow who seduces Napoleon's second wife, Marie Louise, after the Metternich sends him off to seduce her, and he succeeds. When in 1814-15, he later marries her. So he's absolutely furious, and so are some of the other staff officers that that Melas has chosen to accept this convention and not risk another battle. Now, as I say, I think it would have been very difficult for the Austrians. Of course, they fired a lot of ammunition too. It would have been very difficult for them to undertake an immediate battle because they're now all on the western side. They're all on the western side of the Bormida River, so they now have to find a way to get at the French. Napoleon has at least 4,000 more men that are fresh. This General Lepoip, who'd been sent off to the north towards the Po River, had not been engaged. He had been recalled, but does not arrive in time for the battle. Bonaparte also has a fresh cavalry brigade that shows up. It's small, just 2 regiments, but it does show up on the northern side of the field at the very end of the day. Does not engage much, but it's enough to help dissuade Ott from doing anything and convince him he has to retreat. So Bonaparte does have some additional forces, and he has a lot of forces elsewhere in Italy, north of the Po. So Melas could have attempted to retreat to Genoa to the south and try and draw Bonaparte in that direction and then perhaps engage him again, or to retreat to the north, which is what he eventually does under this convention. He can do it safely, to withdraw to the north and hope to draw Bonaparte into another engagement up there. The Austrians probably weren't ready to really have a second battle on the 15th, as I mentioned, largely because of the terrain restriction imposed by the rivers. But yes, they did have other options. I think Melas's philosophy was, or his concept was, that his army's been badly hurt, and this convention allows him to preserve the army, march it back towards the home territories, and then the Austrian authorities, the emperor and his Aulic council can decide to resume the war if they so wish.
Well, Jack, thank you so much. It's been an absolute delight to have you back with us again, and a really illuminating talk. And thank you so much. And Jack, what I'll do, if I may, is if you could send me, well, I'll try and send them by email, or if you have a cell phone number, I could WhatsApp the pictures to you on. I'll do that. I'll take a video as well, so you can see how we laid out the table, and I'll let you know how things go as the day develops. It's getting quite. I think the Austrians have now captured Pietrobuona farm, and they're trying to move on to the Fontanone stream. So we'll see how things develop in the course of the day. But thank you so much for your very good talk. It's been
well. Thank you, and thank you, gentlemen. It's really fun to do this. I have a great. I'm sorry I couldn't see you, and I do look forward to the photos. It's a great pleasure for me, and good luck to both the French in defending the Fontanone and the Austrians in attacking it. And Philip told me that you had also done Gettysburg, a place I visited and led tours to a number of times. And I told Philip, it's a place that never ceases to move me emotionally when I'm there. So I'm glad you were able to do that as well. And we'll look forward to the next opportunity. Philip, I will send you a WhatsApp number, and the email. Will be in touch. And I wish you all a very pleasant afternoon, and good luck rolling the dice.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thanks, Jack. Be in touch soon. Thank you. That's nice.